Hello, and welcome to Flourishing and Artificial Intelligence, Principle 5, The Dangers of Second-Hand News. This was a really fun essay to write, but then a really annoying essay to record because I recorded it and then the recording didn't work and I got frustrated. And anyone who has that kind of inbuilt desire for productivity and optimization that I kind of rally against in earlier essays would get really, really frustrated with that. So I kind of banged around and got a bit angry and then got back down to work. And I actually think the second time through, my recording is probably better. So maybe that says something about persistence and not getting too het up about things. But anyway, this essay, I absolutely love writing because it reminded me quite a lot of my undergraduate degree. I studied a thing called social and political science, which joined the dots of philosophy and anthropology with psychology, politics, and all sorts of different things. And in this essay, I argue against the dangers of secondhand news, of regurgitation, of reconstituted information that potentially imparts the agency of the medium or the person that is speaking, and therefore gets us further away from really trusting, really building strong foundations of truth. This essay joins the dots between Aristotle, this is kind of where you would start, with a little bit of Plato in there as well, with anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, the stuff of all undergraduate anthropology essays, maybe the first essay you ever write in undergraduate anthropology. And then we go on to Marshall McLuhan, The Medium is the Massage. It's a pretty seminal work. It's a bonkers piece of work, and I would encourage everyone to, I would say, read it, but you don't really read it, you kind of consume it. And then we move on to Iain McGilchrist, who takes the neuroscientist view of the importance of experience, of empiricism, of trusting our senses, and the dangers of regurgitation and relying on second, third, or fourth hand news. I also acknowledge the irony in in writing something like this. Writing necessarily is an abstraction, is a representation of other people's ideas, which in turn are representations of their experience or their brains working very, very well. So I acknowledge that this is one stage further removed. But again, my principle, especially in the context of artificial intelligence and in my desire to get back to a state of close to flourishing, is, I have to read the original text. So I read the original text, I buy the book. Occasionally I put it on Kindle, which I know is not great, in order for me to feel confident that my understanding is my own understanding as opposed to someone else's understanding. And then I can furnish it with all sorts of different things around the edges, but that's my commitment to myself. And therefore, even though this is probably secondhand news, this essay, it's at least only secondhand news and not third, fourth, or fifth hand news. So with that, I hope you really enjoyed this essay. Please do provide me with any feedback you have, or remind me of any thinkers or theorists or anything that maybe could be inserted to bolster this argument. Anyway, on with the essay. Flourishing and Artificial Intelligence, Principle 5, The Dangers of Second-Hand News. According to philosophers and the odd rock star, we must be more than a little wary of second-hand news. Extremely smart individuals, likely with furrowed brows, would acknowledge that, like a game of Chinese whispers, the further we go from the source of knowledge, the less reliable it becomes. Generative artificial intelligence presents yet another layer of abstraction away from the solid foundations of empiricism and deduction, the stuff of ancient philosophers. Indeed, philosophers, anthropologists, cultural critics, and neuroscientists have all wrestled with the simple yet infinitely complex question of how we know what we know. This branch of philosophy, known as epistemology, pitted the two greatest philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, against each other. Plato believed that knowledge stemmed from the purest form of reason, deductions which resulted in an ideal. Conversely, his student Aristotle argued that knowledge, and indeed the framing of existence, came from experience. The one area that these philosophers agreed on was the importance of primary sources. To base knowledge on second-hand news was akin to a spoiled scientific experiment. Regurgitating knowledge, whether empirical or rational, was to inherit the biases and the errors of the interlocutor. Following the lead of the two fathers of philosophy, this essay argues for the importance of both experience and reason as foundation stones for both knowledge and flourishing. To rely too heavily on reconstituted second-hand news is to undermine the joy of experience, of using both our senses and our brains, building strong foundations that we can trust. In an age of artificial intelligence, philosophers, ancient and modern, would warn us in no uncertain terms against the dangers of second-hand news. In fact, Socrates could have easily been speaking about the perils of artificial intelligence when he decried the written word. You give your disciples not truth, but only the semblance of truth. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. When is a table not a table? There was no room for poets and Callipolis, Plato's ideal state. Although Plato's supposed disdain for poets has been the subject of millennia of academic debate, we can be confident that Plato is using the archetype of the poet as one who casts a veil over the immutability of knowledge. These sorcerers, these arch manipulators of our base emotions, stand thrice abstracted from the ideal form of knowledge. In Book X of the Republic, Plato's Socrates encourages Glaucon to consider the humble table. There is only one eternal, unchanging idea of a table, a logically sound blueprint from which all tables out there in the real world are created. This blueprint is used by master craftsmen to make countless tables of different shapes and sizes. However, there remains, according to Plato, a single form from which all copies are modeled. So far, so prosaic. It is when Plato introduces the maker of all the works of other workmen, the artists and poets, dramatists and lyricists, that Plato introduces caution. Art, be it a tragedy or an epic poem, is merely an imitation of an imitation, and is therefore thrice removed from the king and from the truth. The imitator is an expert in mimesis, creating entire worlds by simply turning a mirror round and around. But don't ask the artist to build the table that he speaks of, or trust Homer's views on military tactics or schools of medicine. The painter, continues Plato, will paint a cobbler or a carpenter or any other artist, though he knows nothing of their arts. And, importantly, if he is a good painter, he may deceive children or simple persons. So much so that when people see an artistic rendering of a carpenter from a distance, they will fancy that they are looking at a real carpenter. Plato refers to poets like Homer as wizards, creators of imaginary worlds, arch deceivers that take normal people further and further away from ideal form. Plato's student Aristotle, resident at the academy in Athens for almost 20 years, constructed a magisterial rebuttal of his mentor's insistence on forms as the basis of his philosophy. Aristotle, the founder of empiricism, viewed Plato's forms as abstracted thought experiments, existing apart, not tied down by the substance of things. Nor did he agree with Plato's disdain for artists. Aristotle viewed the great tragedians of their age as miners of the soul who did the important job of purging rapt audiences of lesser emotions, catharsis. In turn, Aristotle didn't share Plato's disdain for mimesis, considering imitation as natural to men from childhood, placing art at the center of human experience, it being natural for all delight in works of imitation. However, Aristotle and Plato did have a shared desire which served as the underpinning of their respective philosophies, the pursuit of truth. For Plato, knowledge exists in the purity of his forms, which will not bend or bow to the random, volatile nature of experience. For Aristotle, the human mind exists as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, acquiring knowledge through experience, delighting in and learning from its senses. For Aristotle, seeing, touching, and hearing provides us with the most trustworthy and therefore truth-making evidence that can be relied upon as the basis for knowledge. Both philosophers would caution heavily against dilutions and imitations, which move us further away from knowledge that we can trust. The importance of ethnography. The author, educator, and homeschool evangelist John Holt used a loose form of ethnography to illustrate his belief in the natural curiosity, autonomy, and creativity of young children. In How Children Fail, 1964, and How Children Learn, 1967, Holt presents a fascinating diary of his interactions with young children as he observes the minutiae of their expanding lives. The power of Holt's work was not in longitudinal studies, deductive frameworks, or grand theories, but in the simple act of Holt literally seeing children at their level, getting down onto his hands and knees, playing silly games, and experiencing the world as they see it. Holt never advocated for a scientific method, instead choosing to experience the miracle of childhood development firsthand. Although not strictly an ethnography, Holt's primary observation of development in young children touches on some big questions around the nature of childhood cognition, development, and consequently education and child rearing. So many of his observations end up challenging our top-down archetypal view of children, by calling into question society's often lazy assumption that young children are clumsy, thoughtless, or irrational, design flaws that only formal education can rectify. And it's wonderful to read. Much like the first formal ethnographies of the early 20th century, Holt's work transports us into the worlds and the lives that we have previously only seen as abstractions and archetypes, or indeed reduced to mere statistics. Bronislaw Malinowski is considered to be the patron of modern ethnography. In his 1922 Argonauts of the Western Pacific, Malinowski revolutionized anthropology by moving it off the veranda and into the subject communities. In this seminal work, Malinowski identified 3 pillars of ethnographic fieldwork. Firstly, an anthropologist must document the objective, scientific record of a society's rules and regulations, the skeleton. Secondly, any anthropologist worthy of the name must contend with the imponderabilia of actual life by documenting the minutiae of the daily goings-on within the small community. Thirdly, to really understand the subject community, it is important to try and view life from their perspective, grasping the subject's point of view to realize his vision of his world. Malinowski's Argonauts was a transformative work, with leading anthropologist Sir James Fraser comparing Malinowski's impact on anthropology to that of Shakespeare on literature. By placing himself within an alien community and attempting to rid himself of his own cultural baggage and weighty preconceptions of native customs and cultures, Malinowski revealed a depth of insight that helped readers understand and, importantly, empathize with a community that had previously been the subject of veranda analysis and armchair speculation. The power of ethnography is in its undiluted empiricism. Malinowski and the legions of anthropologists that followed in his wake made the very best use of their senses as trustworthy receptors of information, allowing themselves time to interpret this information and form novel interpretations. Like Aristotle, Malinowski would lament a reliance on secondary sources, warning armchair academics that no matter how many papers they read, it's impossible to gain a true understanding until they witness their subjects firsthand. The medium is the massage. Media critic Marshall McLuhan's 1967 The Medium is the Massage is an extraordinary piece of work. Created in collaboration with the graphic designer Quentin Fiore, it subverts and ironizes the formal structure of a highbrow nonfiction work, neatly bound, lightly with a foreword, preface, introduction, body, and conclusion. What is patently clear as we pass through pages of cartoons, close-up images of body parts, blurry and ambiguous images, arrows pointing this way and that, high art and pop art, whole chunks of text written upside down and back to front, is that McLuhan believes that almost everything has become a representation, or indeed a bastardization, of its primary undiluted meaning. In fact, the very title of the publication illustrates a danger in representation and regurgitation. In McLuhan's 1964 work, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, he coins the term, "the medium is the message," as a central thesis for an argument in favor of studying the medium, a film, a novel, as a more important element of communication and control than the content it presents. According to McLuhan's biographer, W. Terence Gordon, by 1967, the date of the medium's publication, McLuhan had acknowledged that the phrase had become a cliche and welcomed the opportunity to throw it back onto the compost heap of language, to recycle and revitalize it. By changing message to massage, we are now encouraged to consider how mediums of communication massage our senses and our understanding. However, there is also evidence to suggest that the publication was originally intended to be "the medium is the message." However, the typesetter made an error, replacing message with massage. According to the FAQ section of McLuhan's estate website, after he saw the typo, he exclaimed, "Leave it alone, it's great, and right on target." Whether true or not, this wonderful anecdote gets to the heart of McLuhan's central argument. The medium is centrally important for the transportation and representation of a message, and the medium is not infallible. Like a game of Chinese whispers, the medium, from thought to voice to written word to recording, reconstitutes its source material. For McLuhan, the source material and starting point of everything that we attempt to communicate is the human form. Just as the wheel is an extension of the foot, so is the book an extension of the eye. And just as clothing is an extension of the skin, electric circuitry becomes an extension of the central nervous system. The human, its body and its mind, is the source material for everything that has been created henceforth. With mass media, we find ourselves further removed from our source material and therefore less trusting of its output. Writing in the 1960s, McLuhan is particularly wary of electric circuitry, which he believes has overthrown the regimes of time and space, and pours upon us instantly and continuously the concerns of all other men. McLuhan argues that thanks to digital technology, which involves all of us all at once, we now live in a global village, unmoored irrevocably from the here and now of our bodies. Experience and the right hemisphere. Neuroscientist Iain McGilchrist would agree with Aristotle that the senses play an important role in inductive thinking. The right hemisphere is the domain of grounded human experience, delivering much needed information and context to ground the left hemisphere's analytic processing. McGilchrist asserts that the right hemisphere prioritizes whatever actually is. The right hemisphere is Aristotelian, preferring existing things, real scenes, and stimuli that can be made sense of in terms of the living world. According to McGilchrist, without experiencing whatever it is, we would have nothing on which to ground our knowledge, so we have to experience it at some stage. The right hemisphere is where the world actually comes into being. He would likely therefore agree with Aristotle that from sense perception comes what we call memory, and from memory, experience, which serves to stabilize knowledge within the soul, providing the necessary foundations which underpin the skill of the craftsman and the knowledge of the man of science. There's joy here too. Our senses are our most powerful means of understanding the world. They serve as inputs to epiphany, as highly evolved bullshit detectors, as receptors for stunning beauty, and as instruments of human relationships. Our senses make sense of the world. They provide primary evidence in support of knowledge, whilst also framing knowledge with much needed context. Our ears take delight in tone and pitch. Our mouths, tartness and sweetness. Our nose, fragrances, both soft and sharp. And our eyes, the magisterial and the minute. These senses allow us to study, enjoy, and interpret such miracles as the human face, what 18th century German physicist George Lichtenberg describes as the most entertaining surface on Earth. McGilchrist asserts that information from the ears, eyes, and other sensory organs, and from memory, generates the richly complex but coherent world we experience. Therefore, when the right hemisphere is impaired, McGilchrist's patients struggle to decipher between truth and lies, losing the ability to trust what we can touch, smell, see, and hear, and even starting to believe that our loyal senses are tricking us, is the basis of catastrophic mental breakdown. When the right hemisphere is impaired, McGilchrist evidences problems consistent with schizophrenia. Difficulty understanding context, difficulty understanding tone, and a struggle to interpret facial expressions. It is the schizophrenic that abstracts themselves from one's surroundings, relying on piecemeal, decontextualized analysis rather than on an intuitive, spontaneous, or global mode of apprehension. McGilchrist convincingly argues that a reliance upon second-hand news, abstractions and representations, are flimsy foundations for agency and flourishing. To flourish, the right hemisphere, with its senses, experiencing and contextualizing all that is alive, must be the master, controlling and regulating our exposure to and reliance upon second-hand news. Conclusion. In E.M. Forster's 1909 The Machine Stops, unnamed lecturer, indoctrinated in the philosophy of the machine, delivers a dystopian video broadcast to the protagonist, Vashti. Beware of first-hand ideas, claimed one of the most advanced of them. First-hand ideas do not really exist. They are but the physical impressions produced by love and fear, and on this gross foundation, who could erect a philosophy? Let your ideas be second-hand, and, if possible, tenth-hand, for then we will be far removed from that disturbing element, direct observation. Do not learn anything about this subject of mine, the French Revolution. Learn instead from what I think Enoch Manon thought, Urizen thought, Gooch thought, Ho Young thought, Chibo Singh thought, Lafcadio Hearn thought, Carlyle thought, Mirabeau said about the French Revolution. In this passage, the unnamed lecturer serves as the mouthpiece of a power-hungry, omnipotent machine. For the machine to continue to exert its total power, it needs to be able to control information, communication, and knowledge. By reading this passage, we understand that the greatest threat to the machine is first-hand experience, which produces first-hand ideas. Speaking through the lecturer, the machine seeks to drive a wedge between its subjects and their experiences, undermining the gross foundation of human experience as the basis of a philosophy. Instead, the machine compels. Ideas should be second-hand, or even tenth-hand, sanitized and ordered to align with its own philosophy. In this passage, Forster's message is clear. Regurgitated, sanitized, and abstracted ideas bear the stamp of the interlocutor, in his case, the machine, whose motivations we may not know and should not trust. In this argument, we can place Forster alongside Aristotle, Malinowski, McLuhan, and McGilchrist as devotees of first-hand experience as the basis for knowledge and ultimately for flourishing. For each of these great thinkers, theorists, and artists, the advent of generative artificial intelligence would be seen as yet another, more insidious and complex layer of abstraction from the truth of the matter. We can imagine Aristotle compelling us to get back to observation as a basis of understanding, Malinowski would likely encourage us to stop staring at our laptops and get out there to observe cultures and communities firsthand. McLuhan would likely observe all-knowing chatbots as an inevitable extension of the electric circuitry that has reconstituted our relationship with the underlying message. And McGilchrist, alive today, has already come out against the derivative nature of artificial intelligence processing, likening it to a left hemisphere on overdrive, unmoored from the important context, experience, and direction of the right hemisphere. We can only flourish when we acknowledge the limitations and dangers of second, third, and possibly 10th-hand ideas. Armed with this circumspection, we must also reinvigorate our trust in and enjoyment of first-hand experience, delighting in the truth and the joy that comes from using every one of our senses.